Welcome to the Grace and Grit podcast, made for women who want their healthiest years to be ahead of them, not behind them. Join your host, Courtney Townley, right now as she breaks down the fairy tale health story you have been chasing all of your life into sensible action steps and lasting change. Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Grace and Grit podcast. This is your host, Courtney Townley. And as always, I hope you're doing awesomely well. And I immensely appreciate you tuning into this podcast today. And today, I would love to touch on the topic of emotional health. And I say touch on the topic of emotional health because this is a mighty big topic. There are so many different angles that we could approach this topic from. And so this is really just to give you an overview of the value of focusing on emotional health, specifically as it pertains to your overall health journey. So how emotional health influences your ability to improve your health in meaningful ways. And before we launch into this, I thought it would be helpful, because this is such a big topic, to offer you a few resources for you to do a deeper dive into the topic of emotional health. These are resources that have been immensely helpful in my own journey and that I have offered many, many clients throughout the years that they too have found to be useful. So the first one is the book Emotional Agility by Susan David. This, for you longtime listeners, is nothing new. You've heard me mention this book so many times because I don't think there's anything out there quite like it. Susan David does an incredible job of talking about the value of feeling all human emotion. So not cherry picking just the feel-good emotions, and how moving our life to higher ground really requires us to be emotionally agile. So that is probably one of my favorite resources in the emotional health conversation. Another book I read, I think it was about 18 months ago, that I continue to refer to is a book called Permission to Feel by Mark Brackett. Mark Brackett is the director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And he does a very good job at helping people to understand the value of acknowledging emotion and also how to process emotion in healthy ways. He also talks a lot about how important it is to be able to identify specifically what you're feeling. And that's very valuable to me as a coach, because I have found one of the barriers to emotional health with my clients over the years has been their inability to name what they're feeling. So Mark Brackett does a phenomenal job at providing a pathway to become more skilled at that. And then, of course, anything by Brené Brown. Brené Brown's work focuses so intensely on vulnerability and courage and showing up in the world as an authentic human. And there's no way for us to do any of those things if we are not willing to address our emotional landscape. So I've always found a lot of benefit from reading her work, specifically in the realm of emotional health. So why is this conversation so important when we're talking about the health of a human? For those of you who are longtime listeners of the show, you know that the Grace and Grit approach to health is not singular. I don't just talk about physical health, which the diet industry very much does, right? The diet industry is very much focused on purely physical health. But the truth of the matter is, you can't really optimize your physical health if you aren't addressing the other dimensions of health that directly influence physical health. And those other dimensions, of course, are mental health and emotional health, the health of our relationships, the health of our environment, our self-esteem, our confidence in ourselves. There's a lot of other contributing factors to physical health beyond what we so regularly hear, which is just the very small story of diet and exercise. And I always love talking about health as a result of our total stress load. So health is really a byproduct of our ability to manage our total stress load. And stress comes into our life in so many different forms. It doesn't just come in through the foods that we eat. It doesn't just come into our lives through our lack of movement or too much movement. There are so many other things that affect our total stress load. Of course, the way we think about our life is going to affect our total stress load. The way we manage our emotions is going to affect our total stress load. And so I look at emotional health as being a very potent way of helping us to unpack our total stress load. When you have the skills to manage your emotional landscape in healthy ways, you are going to take responsibility for unloading your total stress load, which of course is going to benefit every area of your life. So our ability to feel and process emotion in healthy ways has a huge impact on every dimension of our health, including our physical health. And if we don't give ourselves permission to feel certain emotions, so we're just cherry picking emotions and we're only focused on feeling good all the time, what we end up doing is we end up resisting the difficult emotions. And resisting anything requires a lot of resources. It's a lot of mental and physical work to resist feeling something. Or the other thing that we do is we numb the emotions that we don't want to feel. So if we don't want to feel sad, or we don't want to feel stressed, or we don't want to feel frustrated or overwhelmed, we will numb those emotions by doing things that actually cost us our well-being. And many people never in their lifetime learned how to process emotion in healthy ways. I didn't. It wasn't a part of my curriculum in school. It wasn't something that we talked about in my household. It wasn't something that came up in conversations with my friends when I was younger. And so I really rumbled with how to manage my emotions as an adult, into my mid 30s and early 40s. That's really when I started to learn specific skills that could help me to manage my emotions in ways that did not cost me my health. And that is a big reason why I'm so passionate about this conversation in the work that I do now with my clients. And we are living in very emotionally charged times. There's a lot of opportunity for overwhelm this day and age, especially for women. And please don't hear me saying that I'm minimizing the overwhelm that men feel. But with women who, I specifically work with, we are trying to be all things to all people. And there is a lot of opportunity for us to overwhelm the brain. There's also a lot of uncertainty this day and age. There's always been uncertainty. Life is uncertainty. But especially in the age of something like COVID, we are navigating very uncharted waters, and waters that, if we don't learn how to manage our emotional landscape, can be very riddled with fear and anxiety. So I actually made a post, I think it was on Instagram several months ago, for what topics people wanted me to address on the podcast. And it was really exciting to me how many people asked specifically for more episodes about emotional health. So I would just consider this to be like one of hopefully many podcast episodes for the future. So this is just kind of the start of this conversation. I, of course, have talked about emotional health in other podcast episodes. It's hard for me not to address it in some way in nearly every topic that we cover, but I haven't necessarily hit it right on the head. And my intention is to do more of that, because there's really 4 primary pillars of the work that I do with my students and clients. Number 1, I help my clients to balance their chemistry. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Because if your chemistry is wildly off kilter, it becomes very difficult for you to do things like manage your emotional landscape. I talk a lot about strategy with my clients. So they're using strategy that they can actually win at and that they aren't overwhelmed by. And then the other two components of my work is definitely talking a lot about mental health and working around the mindset of health. And a big piece of that, which I consider to be the fourth pillar, is emotional agility, is helping my clients to lean into discomfort so they can attain the level of health that they truly crave. So what exactly is emotional health? Well, it's our willingness to feel the full spectrum of human emotion and manage our emotional landscape in ways that promote our well-being rather than deplete it. Susan David has a great quote that I thought was really in line with this. She asks the question, who's in charge? The thinker or the thought? Are we managing our own lives according to our own values and what's important to us? Or are we simply being carried along by the tide? And I always refer to this as ownership. Are we just letting life blow us around and not really taking responsibility for what we're feeling and what we're thinking? Or are we taking responsibility for those things so we can actually author our lives? We can shape our lives. I hope it's the latter. The latter is what I encourage my clients to do, to really take deep ownership of their emotional landscape, which is largely driven by the thoughts that they're thinking. So are you managing your emotions in a way that is in alignment with what you want for your life? Or are you reacting to emotions that move you in the opposite direction of what you truly want for your life? So I'll give you just a really simple example. Are you doing something when you're having a really stressful day? Do you give yourself permission to do something like go for a walk with your dog to decompress, which promotes well-being? Or do you consistently pour a glass of wine so you don't have to feel stressed? The first option, going for a walk with your dog to decompress, if health is something you're working towards, or maybe it's just something you're trying to sustain, that action is definitely going to be in alignment with what you want for your well-being. But pouring the glass of wine so you don't have to feel stressed is actually working against what you actually want for your health. So emotion drives behavior. And this is a big reason why I have this conversation so often in the work that I do with my clients. If you are trying to improve your behavior without addressing the very thing that drives behavior, even if you create a little bit of traction, you're not going to be able to sustain the behavior change over the long term because you're not really tackling the thing that is driving the behavior in the first place. So if you're trying to improve your eating, but all you're focused on is following a list of rules and regulations to elicit a certain response, but you're never really getting to the core of being reactive around food, there's a point where you're no longer going to be following that list of rules and regulations. And if you don't have the skill sets for managing your emotions, you will at some point revert back to old patterns. I would say the large majority of the women that I've coached over the years are not struggling with their health because they don't understand the value of healthy eating or, regular movement in the day or sleep. They're struggling because they are using things like food and alcohol to manage their emotional landscape. And it feels terrifying to give up something that has been helping them to regulate their emotional landscape. So some of the things that we do in order to not feel, because that's really what I'm speaking to. We use food and alcohol so we don't have to feel difficult things. Now, food and alcohol don't solve any problems because it's only numbing us temporarily. But because it numbs us, and numbing feels better than the emotion that was in our realm to begin with, maybe it's stress, maybe it's loneliness, maybe it's anxiety, we feel some relief by engaging with those things. But over the long term, of course, there's a compound effect to consistently making that choice. And that compound effect is costing you your health. So a lot of you have heard me throw around the term buffering. Buffering is when we reach for something to change the way we feel that costs us our well-being. So I'm feeling anxious, so I drink the wine. I'm feeling stressed, so I scroll social media. I feel lonely, so I reach for food to feel something other than loneliness. So buffering is a big reason that we aren't at the level of health we truly crave. And buffering is because we do not have necessarily the skill sets or the willingness to feel all human emotion. We only want to feel good and happy. So we do anything, we go to great lengths to not feel anything outside of that. And Brené Brown refers a lot to armor, right? The armor that we develop over time to protect us from feeling certain emotions. My armor, which I've shared many times on this podcast, is anger. It's a lot easier for me to be angry than it is for me to be hurt or disappointed or sad. And so anger has become my shield to not feel all the other difficult emotions. And once I recognized that, it was so much easier for me to get curious when anger showed up. What is this really about? What am I not willing to feel right now that I'm using anger to shield me against? And that completely revolutionized my relationship with my emotions and my willingness to feel other things. And believe me, it's a practice because I'm in no way saying I've mastered it. But just that recognition was a massive game changer for me. So it's helpful to remember that all emotion is a vibration in the human body that is caused by our own thinking. So it is a message that's translated from the brain to the body and shows up as a vibration in the body. But man, do we go to great lengths to avoid feeling certain emotions. And we avoid feeling them because we are so scared of that vibration, which is interesting because there's not an emotion to date that's killed you. And yet there are certain emotions that you will do pretty much anything not to feel. So again, we eat and we drink and we spin out in our heads and we isolate. There's a lot of things that we do because we're afraid of feeling. So what about your life would change if you were actually willing to feel all human emotion? Really consider that question because I bet your life would change in very powerful ways. And here's what I always offer myself and my students and clients. Emotion always has a message for you. It is showing up at your doorstep because there is something it needs you to hear. So you don't need to give it like the microphone on stage. to take over your life. You don't need to allow it to set up camp in your living room forevermore. But you do need to invite it to the table and allow it to be in your presence and hear what it has to say. Because once you hear the message, you can decide what you're going to do about that. So, in the world of women's health, the perceived solution to improving our health is a huge focus on weight loss, or focusing on things like eating less sugar or drinking less alcohol. And all of those things can be absolutely appropriate and really revolutionary to our physical health. But like I said earlier in this podcast today, if we don't address what drove those behaviors in the first place, like what drove the behaviors that led to weight gain, what drove the behaviors that caused you to be in such an imbalanced relationship with sugar, what drove the behavior of drinking every time you felt stress? Well, what drove all of those things is your emotion, how you were feeling at the time. And a lot of us, somewhere along the pipeline of growing up, we learned how to use these things to manage emotions, to suppress emotions, to numb emotions. We're not really processing emotions with food or with alcohol or with social media. We're distracting ourselves from emotion. So let's talk about the actual solution. Number one, you have to acknowledge what you're feeling. And this really is a matter of naming and noticing what you're feeling. And I have to tell you that in all the years that I've worked with clients, this is a real stumbling block for a lot of people. It's very difficult for a lot of people to name what they're actually feeling. So they have a very small vocabulary of emotion. I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling happy. I'm feeling angry, or I'm feeling calm. But I would challenge you to actually Google a list of emotions so you can see how vast the language of emotion is. It's huge. There's so much opportunity for you to feel so many different things. And the more willing you are to get familiar with those different types of emotion, and you start to improve your ability to actually name what you are truly feeling, you are in such a better position to manage the emotion in a productive way for yourself. So Mark Brackett calls this, he says, naming your emotions is key, because if you can name it, you can tame it. So we have to acknowledge what we're feeling first and foremost. And then, even if we acknowledge what we're feeling, sometimes we're so quick to change what we're feeling. Like if I'm feeling something difficult, the objective is to just feel better. And I would just offer you that learning how to allow yourself to feel what you're feeling is so powerful. Emotion does not require a response. We can allow it just to be present, allow it to move through our body without reacting to it. And many of us have gotten so far from that it feels like an impossibility. So we start to practice. And it's a lot easier to practice that, allowing an emotion, especially a difficult emotion, when you recognize it as simply a vibration in the body. So we acknowledge, we allow, and we stay wildly curious about the message that emotion is here to deliver. So what is it? What is the message that frustration has for you? What is the message that sadness has for you? And we get to the root of the message by getting really interested in our own thinking. Because again, your thoughts drive your emotions. So it makes a whole lot of sense if you want to understand the message that an emotion has for you, that you start to really inquire about your own thinking. And this is hugely the work that we do inside of Rumble and Rise, my membership community. We do a lot of thought management and a lot of emotional management so you can create meaningful behavior change. So again, we acknowledge, we allow, we get wildly curious, and then we get to decide, what do I want to do here? What is the next move that I want to make based on the message that this emotion has for me? And sometimes, many times, that answer might be nothing. I'm feeling frustrated. It's okay to feel a little frustrated. I'm working on developing a new skill set. I'm just going to allow myself to move through that. I'm going to think in a way that allows me to move through it in a graceful way. But I don't have to react to the frustration. But sometimes frustration is going to show up because you are thinking about whatever you're doing in such an unhelpful way that is going to require that you pivot your thinking. Because in many cases, frustration will not be useful to you. And that's for you to decide. So I want to give you a few notes before I wrap this up in terms of managing our emotional health. Like I said earlier, and I just want to repeat this because I think it's really important to remember, that emotional health becomes more difficult to honor when our chemistry is consistently jacked. So when you are not getting enough sleep, when you are not eating well, when you are not moving your body, or you're overwhelmed by the way you're setting the bar for your life so high that you're overwhelmed by everything that you have to do, it can be more challenging to manage our emotional landscape. So doing what we can to honor our chemistry actually allows us to up-level our emotional health in a more graceful and seamless way. And I tell you that because I hope it just adds fuel to the fire for honoring your chemistry. So we don't just exercise to look hot in a bikini. I mean, for some people, maybe that is an objective, but we eat well and we sleep well and we exercise so we can actually take ownership of our emotional landscape. The other thing I wanted to mention is sometimes when we have the conversation around emotional health, some people hear that as the objective is to feel good all the time. It's just about the power of positive thinking. And I just want to push against that because I don't believe that to be true at all. The objective is not to feel good all the time. The objective is to recognize that a lot of the human experience is not feeling good. And how do you show up when you're in the space of not feeling good? And the other thing that I would offer is it's not about feeling positive or feeling good. It's really a matter of asking yourself frequently, is this useful to me? Is feeling this way right now useful to me? And there are certain emotions that are rarely, if ever, useful. Shame, blame, overwhelm, worry. These are emotions that often just paralyze us. They're not actually helping us to move our life in any direction. And so I just love that question. And I come back to this question all the time when I recognize, wow, I'm feeling really disappointed right now. I allow myself to feel the disappointment. And once I'm in a space where I can get really curious about the disappointment, is it useful to me? And if I'm working on a project that I just didn't meet my own expectations, Is it useful for me to feel disappointed? Sometimes, oftentimes, yeah. Because it makes me reconsider where I could do things differently. Leaning into discomfort, I talk a lot about, and that is very useful if you're trying to change your life in any way, because learning new skills, showing up to execute new behaviors is not comfortable. So that's not a matter of feeling good. It's a matter of, is this useful for me to feel right now? And this is just my final point, is choose to feel discomfort on purpose. So along your health journey, if you're trying to improve your health, which I assume you are if you're listening to this podcast, is it useful for me to feel discomfort right now? And in many cases, the answer is going to be yes. It's not going to be comfortable for you to maybe eat the thing that you planned for yourself earlier in the day. It's not going to be comfortable for you to go take that exercise class you put on your schedule. It's not going to be comfortable for you to have that conversation you need to have with a loved one to set a boundary. But when we choose to feel discomfort on purpose and remind ourselves it's just a vibration in the body, we do more difficult things. And of course, changing our life requires us doing difficult things. So I hope this helps. I just wanted to sort of begin the conversation of emotional health. I know this is kind of I cast a wide net. There's a lot of pieces to this. But I hope above all else, it just reminds you, or maybe introduces for the first time, the value of focusing on your emotional landscape along the journey to improving your health. Because I don't believe that you can actually improve your health without addressing this. So if you are someone who needs help with improving your emotional landscape and taking ownership of your emotional landscape, we do this very work inside of Rumble and Rise. We talk a lot about how to allow emotions. We do a lot of work around processing emotions in healthy ways. We talk a lot about how to feel emotions on purpose, even the uncomfortable ones. So if you need help in any of those areas or all of those areas, Rumble and Rise is a super affordable space to learn how to do that. So you can check out the details of the membership site by going to graceandgrit.com/ready to rumble. Once again, that's graceandgrit.com/ready to rumble. Be kind to yourselves, and I hope to see you again very soon. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Grace and Grit podcast. It is time to mend the fabric of the female health story, and it starts with you taking radical responsibility for your own self-care. You are worth the effort, and with a little grace and grit, anything is possible.